The sun above Jarkath burned without mercy, a white-hot eye glaring down upon the arena, carved into the ancient sandstone of the desert. The air shimmered. Heat waves danced like ghosts over the bones of past condemned. There was no wind, only silence heavy as judgment. Saria Ven knelt at the center of the arena. Her arms were shackled behind her back with magnetic cuffs humming faintly, draining her energy pulse by pulse. A trail of dried blood ran from her temple, streaking across her face and down her neck, where the neural tether had fried against her skin. Her knees sank into the scorched sand, blood and sweat binding her to the ground. She did not cry, she did not scream. The arena tears loomed above her, 10 levels of alien spectators, each more twisted and jeweled than the last. Every species of the coalition of warlords was here, the scaled Karun, the crystalline voxelates, the silent oblyths cloaked in shimmertech. Their gazes were unified, fixed on one woman, a human, stripped of her title, her voice, and soon her life. A metallic voice echoed across the arena from the execution platform. Saria Ven, former specialist of biosonic systems, carrier of forbidden resonance, summoner of the echo whisper. A ripple of murmurs ran through the stands. The title was myth. To the aliens, it was worse than heresy. It was a weaponized mystery. For breaking the coded silence, the voice continued, for awakening memories buried beneath sacred sand. You are sentenced to death under Section IX of the Bioecho Accord. The crowd let out a guttural cheer, a mixture of approval, fear, and spectacle lust. Saria raised her head slowly. Her eyes, still sharp despite the swelling, scanned the arena, not with panic but a quiet, eerie acceptance. She wasn't searching for escape. She was listening. "Do you deny the charge?" asked the executor, a towering Karun general with segmented armor and a plasma guillotine gleaming beside him. Saria's lips parted. Her voice was hoarse, dust-choked. "I didn't awaken them," she rasped. "They remembered on their own." The crowd laughed. "Proceed," the executor snarled. He raised his hand. The guillotine's vertical plasma blade began to hum, a violet light forming into a narrow crescent above her neck. Saria closed her eyes, but before the blade could descend, the earth groaned. A tremor rolled through the arena, subtle at first, like something shifting far beneath. Then a crack zigzagged across the execution floor. Sand erupted in a geyser of force. Alien spectators leapt to their feet, many screaming in their own guttural tongues. Then the ground split wide. From the depths of the Jarkath desert it rose. A monstrous worm, its segmented body covered in obsidian-scale plates, each the size of a hover vehicle door. Its mouth, ringed with vibrating tendrils, remained closed, not a snarl or roar escaping it. Instead, it curled above the arena like a tidal wave of living sand and stone, blotting out the cruel sun. Weapons powered up, guards rushed forward shouting. The executor dropped his hand, reaching for his blade. But the worm did not strike. It coiled slowly, its immense body circling between Saria and her captors like a shield. Made of ancient bone and earth, then it bowed. The behemoth lowered its armored head toward her, slow, deliberate, until the tip of its skull touched the sand inches from where she knelt. Saria opened her eyes. They widened, but not with fear. The crowd was in chaos. Orders flew, energy rifles charged, and multiple drones hovered above for a better view. Yet in the eye of the storm, Saria remained still. Her gaze locked onto the worm's massive amber eye, which pulsed softly, rhythmically, like a distant echo of a heartbeat long forgotten. She inhaled, not to scream, to whisper. "You remember," she said, her voice almost lost to the dust. "Thean, you remember me." The worm shivered barely, but unmistakably. One tremor through its spine. Saria felt her throat tighten. The last time she had seen Thean, he was a pup, barely the size of a desert crawler, curled in pain with a sonic wound in his side. She had sung to him then, through thought not sound. Through frequency not command, that song had stayed. The executor stepped back, eyes wide with horror. "This is not possible," he growled. "They are not capable of recognition." Saria stood. Slowly, painfully, she rose to her feet despite the cuffs and the blood and the burn. The worm did not move, did not flinch. "You lied," she said, her voice stronger now. "They don't forget. You did." Above, the crowd had gone eerily silent. One worm was an anomaly, but what if it wasn't alone? The sand rippled again. Before the chains, before the arena, before the crowd screamed for blood, Saria Ven was a scientist. At Station Zeta 4, orbiting the barren moons of the outer quadrant, she wore a uniform of midnight gray. Eyes hidden behind the interface visor of a biosonic engineer. She was precise, quiet, efficient. She spoke only when necessary, avoided small talk, and rarely smiled. Most thought she was brilliant. A few thought she was strange. None knew why she avoided pulse diagnostics involving living specimens. None knew she could feel them. Saria had been born on a military outpost called Hellion Cradle. A place where babies cried in harmony, with the vibration of incoming drills and lullabies, were coded in pulse frequencies. Her mother a technician, her father classified. She grew up between bunkers, her lullabies replaced by gunship engines. Her education saturated with obedience. By the time she was 16, Saria had discovered something dangerous. When she sat near certain wounded creatures in the infirmary wing, her breath would sync with theirs. When she touched their skin, even gently, their stress signals would change. And when she spoke, not in words but in the bare hum of her mind, something answered. Echo whisper, that's what she later called it. Not telepathy, not command, but resonance. She didn't control thoughts. She amplified feelings, especially pain, longing, fear, and reflected them back in patterns even the most primal minds could understand. But in a military world, empathy was not a gift. It was noise. At 22, she was conscripted into Project Leviath, a classified task force specializing in the behavioral conditioning of semi-sentient megafauna. They assigned her to the Sand-Wyrm sector, the most volatile, the most feared. No one tamed sandworms. They were desert-born behemoths with neurorepellent scales and minds like endless storms. Saria didn't try to tame them. She listened. She told her superiors the worms were reacting to frequency disruptions. From mining drills, that they remembered violence, not visually but vibrationally. Her reports were ignored until the incident. It was supposed to be a relocation mission. Steer a juvenile cluster of worms away from a proposed outpost. Simple, something went wrong. The worms surged, not at the sonic beacons but at the people behind them. They tore through armored rigs, screamed through the sands in spirals of rage. Dozens died. Saria stood in the wreckage, hands bloodied, with one surviving worm pup curled against her knees. They said she'd turned on them, said she'd summoned the attack. The media called her the whisperer who burned Zeta. Military command marked her as mentally unstable and sealed her file. But she vanished before arrest, slipping through the desert worlds like a ghost. Years passed. She lived on the fringes, drifting between forgotten moons, derelict habitats, and merchant convoys. Wherever she went, the air shimmered slightly. Creatures that should have feared her hesitated. She made no allies, only memories, and one miracle. Theon, a hatchling worm, broken and alone on the edge of a mining crater on Sharon 5. His flank had been pierced by a drilling shard. His cries were seismic, tearing apart comm systems. Killing the wildlife in a mile-wide radius. Hunters wanted to finish the job. Saria didn't. She sat beside him for 7 nights. Never spoke, never moved fast, let him feel her pulse. Matched his pain, then hummed not through lips but through intention. He stopped shaking. She named him Theon, after an old word that meant to remember and forgive. She never told anyone. She knew Theon would return to the sands. And she knew, eventually, someone would come for her. That someone arrived in the form of the Karun, tall, plated in glistening black dermasteel. The Karun were the self-proclaimed wardens of biological sanctity. They ruled the Warlord coalition. To them, sandworms were not animals. They were remnants of a failed age. Beasts too old to adapt, too proud to bow. Their existence was barely tolerated. Their awakening, forbidden. So when whispers spread that a human woman had sung the dunes into motion, the Karun came with ritual blades and plasma chains. They found her outside a refugee clinic on Nuri's 13, treating a feverish child. She didn't resist. They dragged her in silence through the star systems, displayed her on public channels as a lesson. She was labeled Echo Summoner, a heretic, a danger. The tribunal never asked her to speak, only to kneel. And wait, not for trial, for display, for a public death that would signal one message across the galaxy. The age of sentiment had ended, but they forgot one thing. The sands remember, and so did Theon. The cell was cut into the stone beneath the arena, a carved-out wound in the desert's spine. No windows, no clocks, just one strip of humming energy across the ceiling that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Saria sat cross-legged on the cold floor. Her hands were still bound, but not tightly. The guards no longer feared escape, only the suggestion that she might speak, might whisper something they didn't want to hear. Her mouth had been gagged for the first few days. Now they didn't bother. They thought the silence had broken her. They were wrong. On the third night, the door opened with a hiss. He wasn't what she expected. Not another plated Karun enforcer, not a masked drone handler. He was younger. His frame was leaner, unarmored save for a light chest plate. His face bore no markings, but his eyes, deep silver, flickering like mercury, gave him away. Half Karun, half human, he stepped in slowly, holding a handheld neuroscanner. No weapons drawn, just curiosity disguised poorly as indifference. "You're the one who sings to monsters," he said. Saria didn't answer. She studied him, head tilted slightly. The walls of the cell trembled at the edge of perception. He felt it too, she saw, the way he paused, adjusted his grip on the scanner. Then reset his stance like a soldier who suddenly remembered he wasn't supposed to feel anything. "I'm Kale," he added, as if names still mattered. "I'm here to verify the neural patterns in your prefrontal cortex. Protocol for dangerous resonance profiles." Saria gave him a half-smile. "Dry, broken at the edges, checking if I've gone mad, checking if you've been modified." She let the silence stretch just enough to make him uncomfortable. "Did you volunteer for this?" she asked. "Or did they tell you it would make you pure?" Kale flinched. Not visibly, but she felt it, the sharp shift in biofield resonance, like a guitar string pulled too tight. He knelt, attaching the scanner nodes to her temple. "I read your file, what's left of it?" "Let me guess," she murmured. "Says I lost control, that I summoned a worm horde at Zeta." He didn't look at her. "It says you collapsed the command structure of a Tier 5 outpost. That your abilities bypassed sonic dampeners." She leaned closer, voice low. "It also say I sang a juvenile worm to sleep using only breath." He said nothing. "Of course not. That part wasn't useful to their story." Kale stood up abruptly, the scanner chirping. "Your neural delta fields fluctuate. Almost like you're listening to something." "I am." He blinked. "To what?" She stared at the ceiling, then the floor. "To the bones under your boots. They remember more than you do." Kale shut the scanner off, but didn't move to leave. He hesitated, then spoke softer this time. "You're not trying to escape." "No, you're not afraid." Saria looked up at him, her voice calm but sharp. I'm not afraid of being misunderstood. I've lived with that. But you should be afraid of what comes after the misunderstanding becomes law. He swallowed, throat taut, a war inside him, not just about her, about himself. The next night he returned, this time without the scanner. Just silence. He leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching her. They say sandworms are immune to control. They are, she said. Then what did you do to them? Saria shook her head. Nothing they didn't already feel. I just made the signal clearer. That's not science. No, she agreed. It's empathy. Kale hesitated, but they killed. Yes, she cut in. Because they were taught to fear us. We hurt them before we ever tried to understand them. He sat on the floor across from her now. My mother was human, he said. My father Karun enforcer. She raised me on stories. He raised me on silence. And now I'm supposed to believe silence is safer. Saria leaned in, her voice soft. Kale, what if silence is exactly what the sand hates most? That night after he left. She reached out. She closed her eyes, slowed her breath, and sank inward. She didn't hum, she didn't speak. She pulsed, a subtle echo reverberating through her chest into the stone. Down into the old paths beneath Jarkath. She didn't try to command, just called like a memory, like a scar pressed gently. At first there was nothing, then vibration, not from the arena above but from deep beneath. A long, slow tremor, not seismic, not dangerous, familiar. It was like a heartbeat, and it whispered Thean. She opened her eyes. The cell felt different, like something ancient had turned its head in her direction. He was still alive. The next evening Kale returned. He noticed the shift immediately. You reached them. She nodded. They're coming. No, but they know I'm here. Kale stared at her a long time, expression unreadable. Then quietly, he removed a small magnetic key from his belt. Approached her, unlocked one of the cuffs. Saria didn't move. I'm not freeing you, he said. Not yet, but the day of execution is set. And they're bringing in high-rank observers. She looked up. Then I'll need my arms. Kale hesitated, then unlocked the other cuff. Why? Because resonance isn't just in the voice, she whispered. It's in the posture, the breath, the stance of trust. He nodded once. I'll give you 15 seconds of distraction. That's all I can offer. She didn't thank him, he didn't ask her to. The cell door closed behind him, and somewhere far beneath the stone, the sand stirred again. The first strike came not from the sky, but from the Warlords' fear. As Thean's massive body coiled protectively around Saria, the Coalition's commanders wasted no time. Orders shrieked across their comms in a dozen alien dialects. Drones descended from their perches above the arena. Plasma cannons emerged from beneath the tiers. The crowd, once salivating for execution, now surged toward exits. A panicked flood of limbs and shrieks. Fire, the executor roared. The air cracked. Blue-white plasma bolts streaked toward the worm's armored hide. They hit with a sound like thunder trapped beneath stone. Scales flared with radiant heat but held strong. Thean didn't strike back. He didn't move at all. Not yet, but the sand around him began to rise in spirals, reacting to his pulse like breath through a lung. Saria turned, her chains now forgotten at her feet, and locked eyes with Kale across the chaos. He sprinted to her side, just as a section of the arena wall exploded. The worm's tail whipped upward, shielding them from falling debris. They had seconds. Underground, Kale shouted, grabbing her arm. They dashed toward a collapsed corner near the execution platform, where the tremors had fractured the stone deeply. Kale kicked aside a slab and activated a buried panel. Ancient lights flickered to life beneath their feet. Tunnel system, he shouted. Old energy transfer grid. Buried before the Warlords took the region. They dove inside just as another plasma bolt struck the ground behind them. Sending shockwaves through the air, The darkness swallowed them whole. The descent was sharp and rapid, stone turning to sand glass, then to steel. The corridors had been designed for maintenance crews during the first terraforming wave, long before the Warlords claimed Jarkath. Now they were forgotten arteries, silent echoing, laced with cables like fossilized veins. Saria's breath came fast, but not from fear. She felt it again, that pulse. Not just Theon, but something more, deeper, wider. They weren't alone. "Where does this lead?" she asked, voice low as they moved through the shadows. "To the subharmonic nodes," Kale replied. "This place was once a relay, designed to distribute geothermal resonance. Across the sand layers, they say it stabilized the dunes." She stopped walking. "No," she whispered, "it didn't stabilize them. It tuned them." Kale turned back to her. "What?" "This wasn't a control center," she murmured. "It was a listening post." She dropped to her knees and pressed her palm to the floor. A faint vibration tingled at the edge of perception, like a distant chorus muffled by time. She felt it pulse across the skin of her hand, into her bones. Memories, fear, pain, loss, every worm that had died in the sand had echoed here. "This is the convergence," she breathed, "the biological resonance hub. All emotional frequencies across the region pass through this point." Kale's brow furrowed. "You mean like a nerve center?" "No. Like a scar, a place where the memories of every buried worm still vibrate." She stood slowly, eyes wide. "If I amplify the signal here, if I reach them all, they'll rise," he said grimly. "Or drown the planet in a tide of rage," she finished. The corridor shook again, this time from above. Debris rained down. "They're breaching the upper tier," Kale warned. "We need to keep moving." But Saria hesitated. She looked down the hallway to where faint light glowed behind ancient biosynthetic cables, forming a gateway into the central resonance chamber. Her fingers twitched, her breath slowed. Kale saw the look in her eyes. "You're thinking about using it." "I could tell them," she said. "Not just Theon, all of them. I could speak to the whole collective memory. Show them that not every voice is an enemy." He grabbed her shoulder. "And if it goes wrong, I die, you'll kill more than yourself. If the signal destabilizes, you'll trigger a sand tide. A geological chain reaction across every fault line." She turned to face him fully now. "They already want me dead, Kale. They've made that clear. But if I walk away now, all they'll remember is fear." He stared at her, jaw clenched. "You're asking me to help you gamble a planet." "No," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to believe that monsters remember mercy." He looked away for a moment, then slowly reached into his belt and handed her a resonance amplifier. A small, disc-like device etched with old signal glyphs. "You'll need this." Saria took it. Their hands touched for half a second. "I won't run," Kale said. "If you do this, I'll be here." "Then we both gamble." She stepped through the threshold into the chamber. The core was circular, stone and living metal laced together. In its center stood a raised dais covered in dust. A low hum filled the space, harmonic and unsettling. The frequencies here weren't stable. They bent and curved, like the minds that once died whispering into this ground. Saria placed the amplifier at the heart of the dais and knelt beside it. She didn't shout, she didn't chant. She breathed, she remembered. The hatchling she cradled as it screamed, the warmth of its skin under her shaking hand, the way its pain echoed her own. And then she whispered. It wasn't a word, it was a vibration, a shape of grief, a tremor of apology. She offered it not as command, but as confession. The chamber pulsed. Kale watched from the edge, shielding his eyes as the walls lit with golden energy. The glyphs shimmered, the floor beneath them thrummed. And then the sand above screamed, but it wasn't rage. It was song, hundreds of voices, layered, ancient. Tired, not screaming in anger, but waking up from sorrow. Theon's pulse was first, then others, dozens, then hundreds. Kale dropped to one knee as the ground swelled upward, the planet shuddering under the weight of memory itself. He looked at her. "What did you do?" Saria's eyes were wet, but not from fear. "I didn't summon them," she whispered. "I reminded them they weren't alone." The resonance chamber was no longer still. Light bled from the glyphs in the walls. Soft at first, then bright enough to cast moving shadows on the ceiling. Frequencies collided in the air like invisible waves. Saria stood alone in the center, her breath synced to the growing hum of the planet's buried memory. At the edge of the dais, embedded like an anchor into the stone, was the Heartstone. She hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't glowing or humming or adorned with any obvious technology. Just a smooth obsidian structure rising chest-high, veined with faded etchings. But now it called to her, not with sound, with pressure, emotional, heavy, intimate. Like a presence staring back through time, she stepped forward. Kale, watching from the far side of the chamber, didn't move. He seemed to understand this wasn't something he could follow her into. Saria reached out. Her fingers brushed the Heartstone's surface. The world disappeared. There was no time, no ground beneath her feet. Just waves of memory, ancient, raw, unfiltered, crashing into her mind. They weren't thoughts. They were pulses of feeling, entire histories condensed into grief, rage, awe. She saw desert skies ripped open by sonic weapons. She felt the ground split beneath creatures trying to flee resonance harvesters, machines designed not to kill, but to extract emotions like minerals, suffering as energy, despair as data. The worms hadn't attacked because they were beasts. They had gone mad because they were being mined from the inside out. Saria's knees buckled. She collapsed to the stone, breath ragged, heart pounding. The memories weren't hers, but they coursed through her like blood. She clutched her head and wept, not out of guilt but mourning. This wasn't history. It was trauma, alive, burning, echoing across centuries. She forced herself upright, and this time she didn't reach out to command. She opened herself instead. She thought of the girl she used to be, alone in Hellion Cradle. Listening to the sound of drills lull her to sleep. The woman she had become, misunderstood, hunted, hated. She thought of Theon, trembling and small beneath her hands. Of Kale, caught between two legacies, never meant to coexist. And then she whispered, not a command, not a plea, but a story. Her story, her loneliness, her defiance, her mistake. She let it all flood into the Heartstone. The glyphs turned gold. And the sand answered. Above the chamber, the surface of Jarkath cracked once more, not in destruction, but release. A tower of sand spiraled upward as the worms emerged, not in rage, but in silence. They encircled the arena, watching, waiting, judging. And then Theon arrived. He was colossal now, twice the size of any other. His scales no longer dull, but iridescent, refracting the sun like a prism. He coiled around the ruins of the execution platform and raised his head to the sky. Then he let out a sound unlike anything heard before. It wasn't a roar. It was a call, a deep, resonant tone that struck the hearts of all who heard it. Not pain, not warning, invitation, forgiveness. The other worms answered. One by one they mirrored his tone. A symphony of ancient throats, low and endless, poured across the dunes. Saria, still on her knees, looked up as Theon's pulse reached her chest. It didn't hurt, it healed. Kale stepped forward. You did it. But she shook her head. No, they did. She turned back to the Heartstone, which still glowed. Then everything went wrong. A new vibration entered the chamber, wrong, metallic, staccato. Not from the worms, from above. Kale's comm crackled. His face went pale. They've activated a polar bomb, he said. Magnetic pulse designed to collapse sub-resonant structures. The Warlords, they want to bury it all before anyone sees. Saria shot to her feet. It'll destroy the Heartstone. Every memory, every link, and trigger a collapse. The whole convergence zone will implode. Take the worms, the arena, everyone. He turned, running toward the corridor. It must be remote-armed. I can reach it. She grabbed his arm. Kale, no, if it's already active, there's still a window before detonation. Seconds, their eyes met. He didn't say it, he didn't need to. She had already asked him to believe in monsters. Now he would believe in sacrifice. Kale smiled, just a little, barely there. Tell them I was part of the story too. And then he ran. She tried to follow, but he was gone before she crossed the threshold. The resonance chamber trembled again, this time with urgency. The worms above stirred, sensing instability. Saria clutched the edge of the dais, tears mixing with the dust. And then a flash, a sharp, brilliant pulse from the northwest quadrant of the arena. Then silence, the Heartstone flickered, the chamber held. No collapse, no wave, just stillness. Outside, the worms uncoiled, not in panic but reverence. Theon turned his gaze toward the place where Kale had gone. Then bowed his head, not to Saria, to him. She walked out slowly, blinking against the sun. The crowd, those who had remained, watched not with hatred but awe. She didn't raise her arms, she didn't claim victory. She knelt in the sand where Kale had vanished, and placed her palm flat against the ground. I remember, the dust had not yet settled when the rumble began again. It wasn't the aftershock of the bomb. That had already come and gone, a sharp concussion followed by a strange stillness. No crater, no destruction, just absence. The resonance chamber still stood, its core flickering with dim golden light like a candle spared by the wind, but now the ground spoke. It started low, so deep it bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the chest. A single long sound, a growl but not of anger, a call. Theon. His voice rolled across the broken arena, over the shattered execution platform, and into the bone of the land. It wasn't loud, it was immense, and it carried farther than any weapon ever could into the desert's fractured bedrock. Into buried tunnels, into the sleeping hollows where worms had slumbered in fear for centuries. They awoke. One by one, titanic forms rose from the sand beyond the arena. From distant dunes, from forgotten hollows, from just beneath the surface where no scanners ever dared search. Sand-wyrms of all sizes emerged, scales dulled by age, by trauma, by time. They did not rise to attack, they rose to surround. Within minutes, the entire arena, once an amphitheater of violence, was engulfed in a ring of living giants. Some coiled protectively around the tiers. Others curled their bodies into spirals that reached upward, arching together in impossible precision until they formed a dome. A sanctuary. Inside, silence fell. The spectators, alien delegates, warlords, envoys, and soldiers froze. No orders, no movement, no one fired, not out of surrender but reverence. Saria emerged from the stone corridor slowly, her clothes torn and her face streaked with soot. In her hands, she carried the shattered resonance amplifier. Its inner core, now cracked down the middle, still emitted faint pulses. She walked alone toward the center of the arena, toward the platform where she was once meant to die. Theon stood beside it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she lifted the amplifier's broken shell and tapped its activation node. A weak projection flickered to life above her palm, unstable, barely holding. But then a voice crackled through the static, Kale's voice. She doesn't command them. The projection wavered, then stabilized again. Just long enough for his final words to echo across the hush. She's the last thing they still trust. The message hung in the air. No roar followed, no applause. Just wind, and then something unthinkable happened. The executor, once towering armored certain, stepped forward. He looked around at the dome of beasts, his expression unreadable. Then he knelt, not in submission, in understanding. Around him others followed. One by one, warlords lowered their heads. Not a bow to Saria, but to what she had become, not a controller, not a messiah, just a bridge. She knelt as well. Facing Theon, she placed the amplifier gently at his feet. He lowered his massive head and tapped it once with the tip of his snout. The pulse faded, the device dimmed, no more signals were needed. The dome began to lower. Sand-Wyrms uncoiled with glacial grace, sinking slowly back into the sand, not as shadows but as guardians. One by one, they vanished beneath the surface, leaving no trace. No tunnels, no tremors, only calm. Saria remained still as the last of them disappeared. Only Theon lingered. He circled her once, his massive body dragging a trench around the center of the arena. Then, with a final rumble that sounded almost like breath, he turned and dove into the dunes. The ground swallowed him whole, silence again. Saria stood alone at the center. She looked to the alien crowd, no longer screaming for blood, now wordless. The tension didn't leave, but it shifted, from fear to awe, from judgment to awareness. They had seen something that couldn't be weaponized, couldn't be replicated, couldn't be buried again, and so the warlords did the only thing left. They left, no order given, no speech made, just a slow exodus, soldiers filing out, delegates returning to their transports. Heavy mechs retreating into their carriers. There was no applause. No sirens, no trumpets of victory, only the sound of footsteps over sand. Saria watched them go, unmoving. When the last vessel lifted into the sky, trailing silence behind it, she knelt again. This time not in mourning, not even in exhaustion, but in thanks, not to the worms, not to the aliens, not to any god, to Kale. The broken amplifier lay beside her, now quiet. She reached for the shard of its inner casing, just a sliver, and closed her fingers around it. It pulsed once, then went still. She stood and turned from the arena. Not a hero, not a myth, just a woman who had once been hated, then hunted, then held by something old and wordless, and forgiven. 10 years later, the arena was gone, not destroyed, just reclaimed. Wind and time had pulled it beneath the dunes of Jarkath, smoothing over the wounds, burying the blood, letting silence fill the place where thousands once roared. No markers remained, no statues, no plaque, only sand. And a woman who chose to stay. Saria Vin lived far from what was now called the Hollow Ring. Deep in the southern dunes, beyond even the reach of warlord patrols, she built a dwelling carved into rock, half cave, half shelter, surrounded by wind-hollowed stones and sun-bleached bones. Her only companions were the wind, the echoes beneath it, and the occasional visitor who came not to conquer, but to learn. She never called herself a teacher, but they came anyway, young scientists, outcasts, children of both human and alien blood, drawn by whispers of a woman who once knelt beside monsters and wasn't devoured. Saria taught them what she could, not how to control, not how to command, but how to listen, how to breathe in a way the sand didn't fear, how to speak without sound, how to feel the pulse of the ground beneath their feet and not mistake it for danger. One morning, a team from a planetary research institute arrived, academic, well-armed, polite. They brought gifts, water purifiers, nutrient packs, clean fiber cloth. And of course, questions. "We're writing a compendium," the lead researcher explained. "A record of cross-species behavioral shifts in megafauna since the resonance shift. We were hoping you could clarify one point." Saria poured tea. "Clarify what?" "The method," the woman said carefully. "The technique, how you tamed the Sand-Wyrms." Saria smiled, not condescending but gently tired. The kind of smile carved by years, by sand, by knowing too much to interrupt someone's assumptions too early. "No one tames memory," she said at last. "You can only choose whether or not to distort it again." They didn't understand, not fully. But they recorded her words, nodded with respectful confusion, and left by evening, sand swirling behind their boots. That night, Saria returned to her desk. A low stone shelf lined with scraps of paper, resonance chips, old data threads, and a journal handwritten, something almost no one used anymore. She opened it, turned to a blank page, and wrote one final entry. Not for publication, not for posterity, but because the desert, like the worms, never forgets what is whispered honestly. They once asked me how I controlled monsters. I didn't. What I did was stop pretending they were monsters at all. Being human was never about commanding beasts. It was about knowing when to stop calling them that. About knowing when to stop weaponizing the fear we inherited from ancestors who never stayed long enough to understand. The worms weren't born angry. They remembered pain because someone taught it to them. And we had a choice: continue that lesson or teach something else. What we taught was silence, not absence of voice, but space for it. Kale gave his life not for me, but for the space I might hold open. If you are reading this, long after the world has forgotten who I was, remember this instead. Being human was never about surviving the desert. It was about asking, when the sand remembers you, do you still remember who you are beneath the armor? She closed the journal. Outside, the stars had risen. Above the dunes, something massive moved beneath the surface, slow, deliberate content. Saria leaned against the rock wall, hands folded, eyes watching the horizon. She didn't need answers, not anymore. The desert didn't need her forgiveness. And she no longer needed its approval. She had left behind the language of command. All that remained was a kind of knowing, that even when all the voices fade, and the world forgets your name, the echo will still be there, waiting, and somewhere in that echo, a truth that doesn't need to roar to be real.